Welcome back to Tech Function 101. This is Prisha, and in this video we are going to go over Python variables, what they are, how they work, and also go over different types of variables. Variables are there in almost every program and are used for almost every decision made in programs. And so they're extremely important. So without further ado, let's get into it. A variable in Python is a reserved memory location to store values. Any sort of data. It could include numbers, letters, just anything. So variables are like containers where you can store data and use it later on in the program. But when you're assigning and using variables, it is important to know that you can only store one type of data and only one variable name to it. So for instance, if you wanted to store two numbers in variables, you would need to have two separate variables in order to store the two numbers. And the main purpose of variables in Python is to help us remember things in our code. So for example, in our Python file, we can declare a variable x equals 5. And we can also declare another variable that includes a word. And so in this case, let's assign the variable name as y, which equals to, say, the word I want it to be is hello. And notice that this is written in quotations because whenever we write any sort of text in Python, it should be inside of quotations. So here in this example, x is storing the number 5, whereas y is the variable storing the word hello. So here I created a few more examples of variables. And so we created 3 different variables. The first one, name, is a string, which is set to Alice, and since it's a word, it is written in quotations. The second one is age, and we're setting the age of, say, this person to be 25. And the last one is student, is a Boolean value, which is set to true. A Boolean is either a value that is either true or false. Moving on, let's go over variable reassignment and how to print them. You can change the value of the variable that you set anytime throughout your program. So let's say I want to print out the age variable. So what I would do is simply type print, and inside the bracket I would write age. Now notice that this age is not written in quotations, and the reason for this is if you put it in quotations, the Python will simply print out age. However, we wanted to print out variables, the variable age, which is 25. So in order to tell Python to print 25 onto the screen, we need to input the variable name into the print statement. And so as you can see, when I run this, it prints out 25. So moving on, let's say I want to change the age to some other number. Like let's say I set age equal to 26 instead of 25. And then if I again print age, the same way that I did previously, it would print out 26 this time. So initially the age was 25, but after reassignment the age variable, it became 26. And next, let's go over some variable naming rules. When you're working with variables in Python, it is important to know that there are some rules that you need to follow when you're naming and declaring the variables. And if you do not follow these rules, then there can be a potential error in the program. So the first one is that the variable name must start with a letter or underscore. The second rule is that the variable name cannot start with a number. The third rule is that the variable name can only contain alphanumeric characters and underscores. It cannot even include a hyphen, as this would create an error. And by alphanumeric characters, I mean either like alphabets or numbers. And the alphabets can be capitalized or lowercase. The fourth rule is that since Python is case sensitive, we do need to make sure that we keep in mind that variables are also case sensitive. And lastly, the fifth rule is that the variable name cannot be any of the Python reserved words. So for example, continue, and, as, else, except, false, true, import, while, for, and some of these words we'll get into later on, but just note that these are some of the reserved words in Python which you cannot set as a variable name. So just to give you an example, let's create some more variable names. So here, let's say I create a name that includes a underscore and just letters, and set it equal to, say, John, which is a string. So that's why I'm using quotations. And this would be a valid variable, but we can test it out later. Next, let's create a variable that starts with the underscore and set it equal to Jane, which is also a string. And thirdly, let's create an invalid variable. So for this, I'm going to add a hyphen in the variable name. And let's say I'll just set it to 20, an integer. And so when I run this, notice that the first two variables do not create an error. However, the last variable, since it has a hyphen in it, it does create an error. And so that's why it is important to follow and keep in mind these rules when you're working with variables in Python. Next, let's go over variable types and casting. You don't need to declare the type of variable that you're using. You just simply need to type in the variable name which you set and the value that you want it to store. However, when you're casting variables, so what this means is switching a variable type into another type, you do need to define the variable type if needed. So here on the screen, I have a few examples of just different variables that I've set. And so this kind of goes over the different types of variables that are out there. So the first one being a string. And again, as we used it before, we do need to include the quotation mark as it is a string. Next, variables can also be of integer, float, or complex type. And another common type of variable that I would also like to mention is the Boolean type, which is simply either true or false. So the second variable I've set here is a simple example of an integer where I set it equal to a number, a whole number. Looking at the third variable, this is an example of float variable type, as it has a decimal point included. Now going to the fourth type, this is an example of a Boolean variable where I set the variable name equal to either true or false. In this case, it's true. Now let's go over typecasting. So typecasting is a process of changing one type of variable into another. And this is mostly used when you're getting input from a user and say you wanted to get a number from the user. And so what they type and give you is technically known as a string, since they're using the keyboard to type. And so Python considers it as a string. And so in order to take that number and do calculations with it, you need to convert it into an integer first. So here I have a simple code example of casting in Python. So here we have the variable x initially set, which is equal to 5, an integer. And so if we wanted to convert it as to a string, we would simply do x equals str for string, and then put in the value of the integer 5. And this would convert x into basically 5 as a string. So next, let's create another variable named y equals, let's say, 10. And let's make this a string. So this is usually the case when you're getting input, as I mentioned earlier. So say the user entered 10 as the input and you got it as a string in quotations, but you want to convert it into integer. So you do y equals int, which stands for integer, and in quotation put in the value, which is in y. And so now y will be the integer number 10. There's also another way that you can do this. So say for instance you didn't know what the integer value was, since it's an input from the user and it can be any number. So what you can do in this case is do int. I'm going to create a different variable and let's name it I. So I'm going to do I equals int, and this time in the bracket I am going to put y. which is the variable that has the string value of 10. And so again, this will convert the string into an integer 10. Next, if the value was a string and I wanted to convert it to a float, which is a decimal point, it would follow a similar process. So I would do z equals float. Now this just represents a decimal value. And I'm going to put in the value of, say, 3.14 inside of quotations. So now z will be the value of 3.14. And as you can see, when I print all the values, this is what I get in the result. Next, another thing where variables are commonly used are in functions. We will go deeper into this in later videos. However, it is important to know that variables are also used as parameters in functions. That is it for today on Python variables. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tech Function 101. And I will see you next time.